So earlier I touched on like what is deemed as horror or like what you and I personally deem as horror, and I think it's a good thing to touch on. So like what people can kind of expect if they're gonna watch the podcast or the outtakes or anything, like what films we're gonna cover. Because
Yeah,
there's gonna be some films we cover that aren't horror by nature, but they have
yeah,
horror themes in it, or and like how strong is horror implemented in the film.
yeah.
And
So when I think of horror movies, I'm not going to be that guy be like, oh, well, it's not scary, so it's not a horror movie. It's more about how the story and how the direction is framed. Because you can have movies, you know, a lot of like some of the like most popular genres of horror is like slasher movies, which are essentially slasher movies are essentially serial killer films,
yeah,
but through a very different lens. So you could put a movie like I don't know, Friday the 13th Part 2 next to something like Silence of the Lambs, which is another serial killer film, or Seven, which are two that we brought up. The way that they frame Friday the 13th is purposely to scare you.
yeah,
They're setting up scenes of tension with a horror payoff. They're trying to scare you. Whereas in movies like Seven, especially Seven, it's a police procedural film. It's a cop thriller. It's dealing with serial killer related things and macabre sequences showing aftermaths of killings and stuff. But just because they're showing serial killer related things does not make that a slasher film. It doesn't make it a horror film. It is framed as an investigation. It's not so much that it's a who done it, because I mean I guess all cop thrillers like that, mystery thrillers, are technically who done it,
yeah.
but there's no aspect of Seven that is trying to scare you. Disturbing, yeah. There's disturbing movies that aren't horror movies though.
Yeah, I couldn't agree
Same
more.
thing. Same thing with Silence of the Lambs though. Silence of the Lambs is
It
a
it
police
does ride the
procedural
line
film.
a little bit more.
It's a lot closer. And if someone was going to tell me I believe Silence of the Lambs is a horror film, I can believe an argument for it. Seven, to me, that's one that I don't understand how that's a horror film. Silence of the Lambs, there are sequences designed to scare, especially the finale with Buffalo Bill, the night vision sequence. So there are aspects of that stuff with Hannibal Lecter is designed that way too. So I could see that. I definitely think that movie does more so err on the side of cop thriller than anything else. But that's a movie I can see an argument for. Same thing with we were talking about Godzilla in context of the 50s. That's probably a horror film
Yeah,
because it was all about nuclear fear and science fiction related horror in the 50s. So for the time, I would probably say that's probably a horror film. Nowadays, we kind of, as a people, we segment monster films and horror films a lot. Kaiju, like Godzilla started a whole separate genre that more airs on the side of action now, with the kaiju subgenre. You get movies like Pacific Rim and some of the newer King Kong, Kong Skull Island's more of a kaiju movie than a horror. It's not a horror movie, but I would say that movie could be called a horror film. Even Godzilla Raids Again, although I wouldn't want to talk about it anyways because it sucks. But they are designed to scare you. It's just a completely different time.
I look at it more so like a lot of these films are multi-genred. What
Mm-hmm.
genre do you lean the most into? And look at that in the time period, because if you look back on it, Frankenstein's mostly a science fiction movie, but it's still a horror film, especially in the 30s. The idea of those things are terrifying, even if the science fiction aspect nowadays seems more pronounced.
Yeah,
Invisible Man, too, can seem more of a science fiction movie than it is a horror film. But still, in that time period, it's definitely trying to horrify you. My big thing with Godzilla is that it's trying to horrify you, but it leans a lot into the science fiction elements where it almost strays so far, even for that time period, because a lot of B horror films are very science fiction heavy, but they lean way more into science fiction than horror. Like
yeah,
stuff like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, things like The Day the Earth Stood Still. They have horror elements, but they're more science fiction. Versus Creature of the Black Lagoon, where the idea of some creature in a lagoon is very science fiction esque, but the way the movie's filmed and the way the character acts is way more designed like a regular horror film. And that's
Yeah.
why I always consider that more horror than science fiction. It is a science fiction movie, but the elements of horror are stronger than the elements of science fiction. That's
Yeah.
why if you want to say Godzilla is a horror film, I won't disagree, but it's more of an argument. If you want to
Yeah.
say Creature is more science fiction than horror, can't disagree, but I think it's an argument. And films like that, I think, are easy to talk about, no matter how much you consider a horror film or not. But things like Silence of the Lambs and Seven, it's like, you're gonna have to make me grit some teeth to get more discussion as genuinely a horror film versus just a great film. Just
I would
because,
say less so with Silence of the Lambs, but
yeah,
yeah,
less
more
so.
so with Seven.
But I
Seven
feel
is
like
is
it'd be still
a
tougher
hard
for
fight.
me to bite that bullet. Not saying I
Yeah.
wouldn't talk about it. It's not like
Yeah.
I only like horror films. I love a lot of great films, but it's a bit tougher for me to consider that in my ballpark versus like Godzilla, especially for the time period. Because you look at other '90s horror films versus Silence of the Lambs, it's almost like night and day.
Yeah.
That's what I always think is weird for discussion is that you can understand why like you put some of the quote unquote elevated horror from nowadays next to Silence of the Lambs. It seems very similar in tone and almost the way some of it's styled. Because it is meant to horrify you, but the way you're getting the perspective for some of these films is a lot more in style of a thriller than it is a horror film. But it does
Yeah.
become more of a horror film as the films progress. But in the 90s, they aren't like that. The way that this film is put in style is so drastically different from other horror films. And I'm not saying that that's a good or bad thing. It's just that's why it's tougher for me to say, oh, Silence of the Lambs, defo horror. But
Yeah.
personally,
Like I said, I could definitely see if someone wanted to make the argument to me, I would listen to it,
100%.
and
I'm
and
always
I
down
would give
to
that to him.
not just debate, but more so listen.
For me, like Seven specifically, like I've been like
No,
lately, I've been seeing people talk like I see people talk about how like oh Seven's a great horror movie. It's like
no.
I don't. Yeah, it's not
Seven's
a
just a
horror
great
movie.
movie.
Yeah, it's a wonderful movie.
Shutter
It's
Island's a great movie. It's not a horror movie.
it's not a horror movie at all. I saw
Yeah.
that happen. It's like, oh, it's Scorsese's first horror movie. It's not a horror movie. It's not a horror movie. It's a psychological thriller.
Same with
There is a difference, believe it or
Gone
not.
Girl. Gone Girl's a thriller. It's not
That's
a horror
definitely
movie.
not a horror film. That's definitely not a horror
People
movie.
think things that innately have horrifying imagery is horror. It's not. Look at how the movie's filmed. Put yourself as a viewer in the eyes of how you're being framed as the movie goes along. Are you meant to look at it from a perspective where you're trying to be scared, or you're seeing terrifying things happen in scenes and you're wondering how characters are going to react afterwards, or how the things are going to fundamentally unload to expose that scene that was terrifying? It's done very differently. Thrillers are filmed in a very similar way, but also very differently.
Yeah, I agree.
It
It's
doesn't
something
make
that
it worse, it just makes it a different genre.
it's something that comes up a lot nowadays, where people are trying to. It almost seems like sometimes the community of horror is trying to reclaim the
Because they just feel
what
so
should I say?
discredited. Like they feel like
Yeah,
everything
they're
else is so looked down upon. It's like, no, we have
they're
good movies.
yeah, they're sitting there like, hey, y'all are dumping on us on our movies because they're horror, and you're even creating dumb fucking terms so that you can excuse the fact that you enjoy a horror movie. So we're gonna reclaim this movie that's not even horror
Yeah,
because it has an Academy Award, which is Silence of the Lambs.
and I get it because when you feel like you're so dumped on, you want to be like, no, but what about this is cool, right? And
Yeah,
that's kind of why, like, with the whole bullshit archetype of elevated horror, a lot of horror films that are getting a lot of talk are filmed and directed in a certain way where they're done. That's why I'm really glad that Halloween 2018 came out, because you can show a more classic and retro perspective of horror, but still give it a modern flair where it's still a good movie. Yeah,
yeah,
there's some stupid shit that I complain about to you all the time, but I think it's a good movie for sure. It's fun.
yeah,
And it's a horror movie. Like, you should be able to tell horror movies in different ways. I don't want all my horror movies to ride the line of being a thriller. I'm gonna get bored of that. You can make good movies and still have them be a certain genre, but be multifaceted and different.
That whole thing with elevated horror, though, it comes down to post 1980s. The term horror movie is really associated with
Slashers.
slashers,
Yeah.
schlocky movies of that kind of genre. So basically, if a movie is even slightly mature or tries to attack a theme of any form, well, that's not really a horror movie, is it? She's
Yeah.
like, no, that's not true. You guys love The Exorcist. That's a mature movie about people finding their faith and stuff. There's plenty of emotional, deep themes in that too. You know, Rosemary's Baby. That's a horror movie. It's a very mature movie. A lot of people really just associate horror with this low-brow level of cinema, and that's why they gravitate towards these movies that are these thrillers, and they call those horror movies because they're good.
Yeah.
And you know, like, I'm not gonna dump on Silence of the Lambs. It's a fucking amazing movie. It's a masterpiece, genuinely, and I mean that. But it's just because a movie is really good. It's almost like people sometimes try to make excuses for why they enjoy the genre. She's like, you don't have
Yeah.
to. It's a genre. It's
Yeah.
entertaining. There's good action films. There's bad action films. There's good dramas. There's bad dramas. We're not talking about elevated dramas. We're not talking about elevated action films. We're not talking about elevated sci-fi movies. It's all a genre. And the making an excuse for why you enjoy Hereditary because it's elevated above other movies because it has psychologically complex themes makes you sound like an asshole.
Oh yeah.
Straight up. That's all it makes you sound like. Because you're condemning an entire genre based on a decade.
Oh yeah. But that's another
irritating.
way to say it. It's like it is a genre, and as a genre, we should be able to get multiple different types of film, not just good or bad, but just the way that we're telling these stories. And ever since, I'm not gonna say Get Out started it, but like Get Out especially, it's like a lot of films have been done in a very similar manner.
I would
With
say like when the term elevated horror was becoming a thing, Get Out was one of the first ones.
yeah,
It was
hundred
like it was
percent.
like Get Out, Hereditary,
Midsummer,
Midsummer,
right?
Us.
Yeah,
You know, like
and
it was these specifically very mature, thoughtful horror films.
yeah, and I get it, but there's also horror films that can be told differently and also be really good films, but not structured similarly. Like, It is a horror film. A lot of it comes down to being like an 80s nostalgia rum. I mean, the first one,
Yeah,
where it's
yeah, no,
like
I know.
almost Goonies esque, but it's designed to scare you with a lot of scenes. It's a horror film. And I want films that are horror to be good, but also I want them to feel distinct and different. It's good
Yes.
to have like a kind of more like tongue in cheek movie once in a while where it's referencing the stupid shit that can happen from horror films. That's whatever, as long as it's not too overboard. Overboard. I also want to have films like Halloween 2018 where it is a revival of a way of telling the story, but at the same time, like making it a good movie as much as you can be.
Yeah.
Have films like It where you can tell a good complex story with characters, but also have them designed to scare you and not filmed to be more ride the line with thriller. I love the A24 films. I love that they have films like Midsummer and Hereditary, and especially Us and Get Out. But I don't want all my horror films to become like that. Even Don't Breathe, which I consider more of a thriller, you could definitely say is a horror movie, but that's still
Yeah.
done
I
in
would
this.
call I would call it a horror movie,
Yeah,
but
that's
I
still
also
done.
100% understand why you would look at that as a thriller though.
Yeah, that's still done in a very similar manner to the whole elevated horror genre. Like,
Yeah.
I want my horror to be multifaceted again.
Yeah,
And
I just want people to fucking just get over it. Like,
yeah,
just get over the stigma that horror has and just enjoy a movie. It's
yeah,
you don't have to sit here and say like, oh, that was good for a horror movie. No, it's just a fucking good movie, man. Don't be a
yeah.
dick. Don't give backhanded compliments. To me, that's the whole
I'll say
thing
that
with
about 90s horror films sometimes, though.
yeah, but like that's dogging on movies and goofing on them where this is
Yeah,
serious. Like people
yeah,
are like
100%.
seriously like again, like they don't they're not comfortable just enjoying a horror movie, so they have to
Yeah,
make excuses for why they enjoy it, and it's basically a backhanded compliment to the genre at that point,
100%.
because it's just like, hey, you're good for a horror movie. This is better than that, so it's above what I consider to be a good horror movie.
That's why directors, when they're starting, don't want to do horror movies because they get lambasted and stuck doing the genre and they hate it. You
Yeah,
know?
it's really frustrating as a fan of the genre.
Oh, it's super frustrating. But hopefully, we can get more distinct, dynamic horror films. We can have more fun arguments with people deciding is it horror, is it not? Who knows? That's for you to decide.